Welcome to the Hudson Valley One podcast. I'm your host, Zach Shaw. With me today, once again, is the head honcho at Ulster Publishing, publisher of Hudson Valley One, Geddy Sveikauskas.
Head honcho it is.
And we're here in Uptown Kingston. And something happened here in all of Kingston, but certainly the epicenter was Uptown, and it has one word.
Gentrification.
There's some news about that in the paper this week. There usually is news about that every week, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, it's certainly a hot topic. I think people are very much interested and involved because everybody knows somebody who's got a problem, and housing is, certainly one of the number one issues. I noticed that March Gallagher, the county comptroller, put out something saying that the Industrial Development Agency should focus its efforts on helping with the housing problem.
Sure.
So that I myself don't think it's number one, but I think it's very important.
Well, and gentrification is one of those issues where you're like, where do you start? It's quite complex. There's a lot of things at play. I mean, you've been here in Uptown Kingston for how long now?
25 years, probably, close to it. Yeah.
You're one of the few original Kingston folks who still owns their building and owns their setup here.
Well, regarded by some people as an outsider and a newcomer, it's nice to have that honor.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so what is your take on this, having seen it happen in front of your eyes?
Well, I think of it that there are three populations involved. There's the people who come up from the city, mostly. There's the people who find it hard to find a decent place to live in their own hometown where they grew up. And there are the people who rent out their houses for B&Bs and stuff like that, and that's an important component of the whole thing. I noticed that a few weeks ago that the county announced that it was taking over the Quality Inn, I guess they call it, across the thruway, and I thought that was quite interesting, because according to the data, the Social Services Department puts up about 250, 300 families in motels at the going rate. So basically they pay $125, whatever it is, to be in a rather shabby place with restricted space that's not theirs, and that population exists every winter. So by converting that to regular housing, the housing for the same people, you at least have about 100 units and that cuts down on the 250 quite a bit. So if you had another project, like two other projects like that, you wouldn't have people sleeping on the streets, and they'd know that where they put their head to go to bed one night, it will be the same as the next night.
Right.
Yeah. And
over, they're doing that at the old county jail in Kingston too, right?
Well, right. That's a different kind of housing project. That's, but the most compelling is the people who have nothing, and the less is, well, how many units of housing do we need? I would think that given the difficulties of pulling this stuff together, that the county will have, say 50, 100 units of new housing every year, and if you could jack that up to 200. But housing is very expensive. It's expensive to build, and right now, as you know, there's very little new building going up.
Right. I mean, it's kind of salt in the wound because we have low supply. Certainly we've gotten inundated with people moving here from other places, mainly the city.
Right.
But in addition to having that low supply, we have probably a record number of Airbnbs going on in this area.
Yeah.
And so there are all these competing interests that have yet to really seem to find some common ground, and we see that in the reporting in the newspaper of these town meetings where you've got, like a handful of people who show up, and you've got some Airbnb people, you've got some tenants' rights people. Where are they going to find common ground in this?
Well, it's hard to find common ground, obviously, but you come up with a solution that at least offers some promise and improves the situation, and then you can hopefully accelerate that improvement. For instance, if the County of Ulster has, as it has, $38 million from the Recovery Act, that's one of the places that money could go. And there are state programs, particularly in federal money. In addition, housing is very complex. If you look at what RUPCO puts together for a housing project, there are about 10 different pockets that the money comes from, and it's like a steeplechase. Each one is an obstacle of its own. You pull them all together, and finally you get the project done. People are happy. They love what the result is, and then you say, well, I've only dealt with 1 or 2% of the problem.
Sure. It's incredibly complex to get an affordable housing project through, and I think a lot of people look at the RUPCO projects and it looks like magic to them. They don't see that behind-the-scenes struggle of getting the neighbors to approve, getting the various government agencies to approve.
Well, partly there's the neighbors are never happy.
Right.
So the neighbors express their unhappiness, and they say, well, we've done our share. Somebody else should do theirs.
Right.
And that's very often applied to the city of Kingston. Now, there's a good reason the city of Kingston has services, availability, transportation, various things that are easier than other places. However, I think they have about half the affordable housing in the county, half the subsidized housing. Why should they take more?
Right.
And you can see that from both sides.
So the question is back to, how do we find common ground? What are local politicians doing to address this crisis, right? We can all agree that it is a crisis. And so in the newspaper we see, for example, New Paltz, what is the good cause eviction law, which is also sitting around in Kingston waiting for someone to look at it, as far as I know. And then they're saying, well, that's going to be a little too hard. What we want to do next is actually talk about not rent control, but sort of trying to keep the rents down, trying to keep unconscionable rent increases from happening. Those seem like very small steps to address what is a very large crisis.
We live in a world of large crises. I've got this mask here. That's
on your beard.
One crisis that we are all familiar with.
Right.
We have a crisis in that we don't have enough good-paying jobs. We also have a crisis that employers can't find people to work for the wages they offer. Mm-hmm. So housing is not the only crisis, but I still I have this feeling when somebody who close to 50 years ago bought a house in the country simply because I was tired of living in the East Village in New York, and I couldn't imagine a better life than this one. And then I found out, hey, there's no way of making a living around here.
Right.
And that was before IBM left.
So, now we're having, my friend Ines Lawrence, who runs Ollie's Pizza out in High Falls, very successful local restaurant. They had such a hard time finding help to work there that they're building a one-bedroom apartment specifically to house someone to work there, because the housing is the critical issue that is really impacting their ability to find people. No one's going to move here and work in a service job if a one-bedroom apartment costs $1,800.
Yeah, of course. But the places which have housing problems not quite as difficult as we have that same difficulty of finding employees.
Right.
So partly it's on the employee side. People say, well, I don't want to work for what they're offering me. I'd rather not work or wait until the savings run out, or try some other gig that works.
Right.
And I think it's a good thing that people find it hard, employers find it hard to get people to work for them, because they should pay more.
Right.
It comes down to that. That's more important than anything else. And I noticed that last month there's a record high number of people quitting their jobs,
Mm-hmm.
and that's going to continue. So it's no longer employer and employee, the same balance as it was, where the employer generally had the upper hand and rewarded himself or herself handsomely, and tried to pay as little as possible to the people who work for them.
Right, exactly.
So that's a good thing. And what we seem to be having is that there's the employer, there's the employee, and there's this whole world of independent contractors or semi-independent contractors in the middle, who negotiate to do a particular gig for a particular amount of time, and get paid well for it,
Mm-hmm.
like yourself.
Well, I'm trying. So, but you've been around forever. You've seen this happen. So, what's the solution? Where do you see this going in the next few years?
I think the only solution is just to keep doing what we're doing, only put more money into it, and therefore be able to do more of it. That I think if we, since the pipeline takes so long to fill up, you damn well better get to work at it.
Right.
And it's difficult. Like Woodstock a few years ago built this thing called Woodstock Meadows, and the people in Plockerman Lane, one of Woodstock's fabled artists and Beamer's residence at the place where the band concerts are, etc. But a housing project there, 50 units.
Mm-hmm.
It was hell. There's no benefit to the politicians, because the people who are against it in the grand Woodstock tradition are always louder than the people who are for it.
Right. Right.
So you have to somehow overcome that predilection and say, come on, we should all row in the same boat. You can't have some people who are a bunch of passengers who don't do anything, and people who grumble about doing everything.
Well, and I saw this in the paper today. It seems like the strategy from politicians, from developers to fight against that is to sort of say, we've allocated the money. We have the money. So if you oppose this, then you're just throwing away all this money and all this opportunity. Your options are basically, this development that we want to make, or these renovations that we want to make, or we don't get the nice things.
Well, I don't think the way the folks look at it is, here's this housing project, it'll be like the other one, bunch of criminals, right? Don't work, they get arrested for crimes. We've got more than our share. I don't know why our lovely little neighborhood is being bothered by this, and that's regrettably as loud as the people who say, this is a social problem that needs a solution, and needs a more drastic solution than we've been using, and how can people have dignity if they don't have a place to live, etc.?
Right. So it's not just the money. There needs to be a cultural shift amongst people.
Amen.
And I think that, unfortunately, these many crises that we face might actually force that culture shift. Because if we have a supply crisis, if we have an affordable housing crisis, people are going to have to change their behaviors and their outlooks on life.
Well, the grumblers, we live in a society where people are fixed in their views, and you don't change them very easily. You don't say, well, look at it from the other side. and work it through. They say, this used to be a great little town, but it's going to hell. And did you hear about that project for senior citizen housing?
Right. I mean, almost every other paper, there's an article about, the neighbors oppose the housing for recovered addicts.
Yeah.
And so.
Well, one way is to say, okay, let's all agree that it's a problem. And the next thing to do is to find out how much of where you get the money for the housing and how much of it goes where. And that would be a county plan. Well, if they had a county plan, it would just be the grumbling would come earlier.
Right.
Because, they look at that. Well, worsening has this and that, and they look at it, and they, have criminals roaming the streets and all kinds of mischief, and we don't want to be like that. We're a nice little country town, etc. Everybody has their own case, and they're not wrong, but you can't see. In a selfish society, you can't just see your point of view and imagine that other people have a different point of view that's equally valid. And I think it's a job of the media, a job of a newspaper like ours, to point out the contradictions in that, and to have people kind of be more understanding of each other's point of view. The first step would be, well, I can see what you're talking about, but I'm still against it.
Right.
But that's the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. There's just been so much discord and divisiveness culturally in our society, encouraged from the top down. And so, in a lot of ways, I think that it's important for us to talk about this stuff here and for people to read the paper, because this is emblematic of what's happening on a national level. And we certainly are the place where housing prices rose more than any other place in the country for a certain period of time, right?
Well, that wasn't true, but it was. Yeah.
It made good headlines.
Okay, so what you have in around here is the New York thing. Now let's look at the kind of people who come up here. They're very often younger people. They're beginning to start families, or they're older people wanting to retire a little bit. They're from Manhattan. Well, those people are from a dog-eat-dog world, which is economically and technologically years ahead of where we are. They have something they could bring to us, but they also take up our space, and we need somehow to figure out some way in which we can make sure that we maximize the benefit we get from these people. So I said, I'm in favor, for instance, of talking to them. What the hell are you doing up here? What are your plans? Can you create some jobs?
Right.
And I think that would bring our local economy, which is fairly stagnant, into some kind of more active state, which would be a good thing. Incomes would rise, would work. But that's as you said, it's only part of the picture.
Right. So complex, and we've just scratched the surface. I guess if you want to go deeper, you're going to have to read the newspaper. Right.
Absolutely. You've got to read the newspaper. The solution to all problems.
It's online at HudsonValley1.com. It's in print all over the county. And I mean, I really appreciate having your wizened perspective from being around here so long. But I think we need a slightly younger perspective too. Maybe we can bring someone in on the second half of this podcast that could shine some light on even the fact of why we're talking about gentrification.
Right? I was thinking, I have this daughter who sort of has worked with me since she was 3 years old, and she is really a pain. And she's younger, and she has sees things from a different perspective, and I learn from her, even though I would never admit it.
And not incidentally, she's also, the critical person in keeping this newspaper going, right?
She sure is. So I'm not.
We'll talk to Genia after the break. Stick around.
Yeah.
We are back on the Hudson Valley One podcast with Genia Wickwire, the aforementioned daughter. And what's your official title here?
Well,
If you have
I could go by associate publisher, I could go by sales manager, I could go by business manager. Just like any family business, it's you do whatever. I take out the garbage sometimes. I, do whatever needs doing.
So you and I have worn many hats here.
Yes,
Done many different things.
yes. It's good to have you back.
Well, thank you for having me back. This is so much fun, and we're doing something that we've never done before with this podcast. So
Zach worked for us when he was 18. So it was
right.
a long time ago.
I never had to get a real job because I went from high school right to Ulster Publishing.
Yes, exactly.
And coming here is just like coming home. And there was a sign on the front door. This is what got us started to talk about gentrification, right?
Yeah, so I came in this weekend and it was packed outside. We're right next to Sissy's restaurant, so packed with tourists all along the street, and there was a sign on our door that said gentrification zone, poor people please leave quietly. And being as you mentioned, one of the locally owned buildings that runs their business in the building, I thought, well, that's an interesting message, but it's not our message. So I did what we do nowadays if we're not 82. I posted it onto Instagram and I just said, hey, this isn't our message, we're family owned since 1972, and I just didn't want people to feel that we were specifically the gentrification zone, although I did appreciate the message and understand where they were coming from as I looked around and saw all these tourists.
Right. And you've been around forever, so you've seen these changes happen, and that must be mortifying to see that, but we're one of the exceptions of being, not fighting against gentrification necessarily, but you could say you're keeping people informed, so that is one thing. But is gentrification even something you fight against? It kind of happens, right?
Well, I think that it's important not to think you can do nothing, because then the whole area becomes what you fear. So, for example, my childhood friend, who I've known since 4th grade, because, that's how it is around here, she is putting on a protest on October 24th that starts in Woodstock. It drives through Kingston, it drives through Saugerties, and she's getting a lot of pushback. Why are you doing this? What do you hope to accomplish? And there are things that can be done, not to stop it completely, obviously. I mean, this has been happening up here forever. But there are various things that I've actually learned that you could do to sort of make it a little more fair, I guess, even the playing field. So Anna Orslich is the person who's organizing that. And one of the things that she pointed out, I'm going to talk specifically about Woodstock just because it's just an example. And that's where I grew up, Woodstock Times. So I literally grew up, on those streets. So it's interesting to me to look at. And Woodstock allows 90, I believe she said, unoccupied short-term rentals. That's not the case everywhere around here. West Hurley allows 0. Rhinebeck allows 15. New Paltz, I believe, somebody might correct me on this, allows no unoccupied short-term rentals, which means you can't be owned by some corporation or someone who's not involved in the community, who doesn't give to the community. They just buy up the real estate and they just rent it out as short-term rentals. And that's happening everywhere because of Airbnb is huge and you can make a lot of money off of it. So one thing you could fight against is make Woodstock have 0 unoccupied short-term rentals, which would free up 90 properties. And in towns that we're talking about, it's not huge. So 90 long-term rentals coming back onto the scene would really help to quiet the voices of these angry people, you know. So there are, it has to be from a law standpoint, though, you know. It has to be like legal changes. And the other interesting thing about Woodstock is we're saying this, and there's nobody running, there's no unopposed elections happening right now in Woodstock. So you either have to be really loud and aggressive towards the existing ones, or you have to become part of the political system there.
That's, yeah, when you told me this stuff earlier, it blew my mind that they would allow for that many vacancies. It seems like such an easy fix. And then you reminded me, well, who's going to fix it? Who's going to step up from the community and really make this a priority? That's really the...
Right. And people, I think when they hear a competing argument, they're not really listening. So these people who are protesting, it's like, well, you're trying to stop us from making a living renting out an apartment on our property. And we're talking about 90 unoccupied Airbnbs, basically. So that's an easy fix. Another easy fix would be raising the tax rates for second homeowners. So we're not saying you're not allowed to have a second home here, but we all, you know, some of us do gardening or plowing or whatever for the second homeowners, so that's fine. But you know, my dad argued with me that we have friends who have a second home since they were children, so they've had it in their family. Should they have to rent out their place? And I said no, but we know these people, and we know, say they, for example, pay $10,000 in taxes. We know they can afford $20,000 and that they're attached to their home, and they would probably easily do that. And if they didn't want to pay the higher taxes, they could sell. And that's no more sad than people who are trying to keep their first home in Woodstock.
Yeah.
So there's another simple thing that doesn't affect anyone who's living here full time, because I don't think the message is that we don't want people moving up from the city and living here and participating in communities. The message is that if you're not up here participating in the community, you should pay more.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And or not be allowed to have an Airbnb here. So I think there are some fixes that are not that complicated, but again, it comes down to local politics and whether anyone's allowed, you know, going to put out there. I was shocked about 2 months ago, we ran a story that said Woodstock has no opposition in any of their elections.
Yeah, it's
and
incredible.
I'm thinking, wow, in this atmosphere, nobody stepped up.
It takes a really special person to become politically involved, and so many of the candidates that I've talked to, so we're here in election season, have really just said the same thing. You know, they came to a point in their lives where they couldn't take it anymore. They couldn't take the injustice and the indignity of what was going on, and they reluctantly became politicians.
Yeah. I mean, you pointed out that there's some, you know, interesting characters in the Kingston political scene.
Yeah.
So that's good. That's refreshing. That's
Absolutely.
What you want to happen.
Especially in a place like Kingston, where, you know, that's my Woodstock. That's where I grew up, and
right.
You know, gentrification has gone through the roof here. We're sitting across from 323 Wall Street, which, you know, several years ago was the heart of Kingston's nightlife and culture, really. BSP. Anyone who ever went there or was involved with that knows that that was one of the best things to happen to this area. And you know, not to get into specifics, but it's been sitting pretty much empty there for the last several years. That's not the same as, you know, a short-term rental, but it's very problematic when you have things sitting just completely unused.
Yeah,
that are cornerstones of the community.
Right, and why they're not being, I mean, it should be astronomical taxes if you're, I mean, there are increased tax rates for, you know, empty buildings after a certain point, but it's still not enough. And then where is that money going? Why isn't it being reinvested into, you know, more long-term rental solutions and stuff like that?
Right. And let's talk about, you know, the people that are being affected by this. And I mean, I'm affected by this as a renter in Kingston, but certainly I wouldn't put myself in the same categories of people who are just completely being displaced, who have no options, no opportunity. And in a way, this has already happened. It's already done. So many people have had to leave this area because they can't afford to live here anymore. And as we talked about with Geddy, it's a very complex situation. But what I'm hearing you saying is, well, it doesn't have to be complex if you just get up and do something about it. Even attend a protest or be more informed, right?
Right, yeah, I think that's a big thing. And, I work here and sometimes I'm like, oh, I didn't know that. So there's just constant more information and more ways of working things out. And again, I hate to agree with my father, but he said, you just have to keep the conversation going and you have to keep it open and you have to listen to the other side. Because again, I was watching my friend get shut down and it was like, wait, they're not hearing. Back to the Instagram post, somebody said from the city, oh my God, I can't believe that this is being posted. I feel so rejected. I moved up here from the city and, okay, if you don't want my business. And I said, whoa, nobody's saying that. Like, you came up here and you live here full time and we're not talking about you. Like, even if you have a rental that you need to rent out to live up here full time and to be able to afford it, you're not the problem. We're talking about legislation. We're talking about, capping rent increases, which they do in the city. So why can't they do it up here? That seems like a logical place to go with it. And she immediately agreed and thanked me for having the conversation with her. And then I just ended by saying, if you want to be a local, then listen to what the locals are saying and join the conversation. If you believe in legislation for rent hike increases, then say that. Stand with the locals.
Right, yeah.
Be local. And that's, we used to always say that, read local, be local for our paper, because if you want to be local, you need to know what's happening locally.
Right. And this is why you are running these social media. You're the voice of the Hudson Valley One social media, because that response is just so, empathic, and, you're caring about them. You're not trying to stir up negative energy. And I think one of the big problems with all of this is that people are online just throwing shade on people and saying things they would never say in real life, creating enemies virtually. When if we all could sit in a room, we would all realize how silly and stupid it is to troll people online, and just what a waste of time that is.
Yeah. Every time I post a nice picture of up here, I get oh great, you're bringing more tourism.
Right.
It's like we've been doing this, we haven't been doing it on Instagram, but we've been writing about this area and, praising it and showing beautiful pictures, for 40 plus years. So we're not doing anything we haven't always done. And, we live in a beautiful area.
And that's, I think, what I've felt all my life is I've traveled around the country. I've seen a lot of other places. This place is truly, truly special.
Yeah.
So when everyone came in from New York City during COVID, I was not surprised at all. I was only surprised it took this long. We were, instrumental in this Move to Kingston Now hashtag, right? Being on Instagram, you probably know that was started, I think, by Mike Amari from BSP. And we would sit together and we would all talk about, even before then, we would talk about, like, we got to get people up from the city. Let's get a bus to just bring them up for a week.
Now you'd be like burned at the stake for saying that.
A lot of those people, exactly, are pointed at as like, you created this problem, which is absolutely untrue, because there was a time when there was a good balance. When BSP was drawing national acts and packing the back of the house with hundreds of people and having these like epic New Year's parties and Halloween parties, when there were kids events all the time, when there was a moment where it was all kind of clicking, and then the balance kind of shifted with the gentrification going into accelerated mode during COVID. And I think now we're in this period of time where we're kind of looking around, the dust is settling on that.
Yeah.
And we're saying, well, what do we do now? And like you said, I think the first step is start the conversation. So hopefully
Yeah.
this podcast
Yeah.
serves to help start the conversation. If you have anything you want to add to the conversation, please leave it in the comments or just drop us a line. Where can people get in touch with us?
Well, the easiest way is emailing info@HudsonValley1. The one is spelled out ONE.com, not the number. Go to our website, get a paper. We have all our contact information in there. Instagram, Facebook, we're hard not to find.
Yeah, so get involved. Let us know your thoughts. Drop us a line and become part of this conversation. And thank you, Genia, for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you, and thank you for starting the podcast. It's
My
great.
pleasure. So much fun. And we'll see you next time on the Hudson Valley One podcast.